What I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is set for you a cultural backdrop of what we really see, particularly in the North American mindset. And the lecture will take you more through a sociological analysis looking at the last 2 decades and how we arrived at this particular time in the way we think and the bases on which our decisions are made. I have often summed it up in question form. How do you reach a generation that listens with its eyes and thinks with its feelings? That is very descriptive of how we absorb information today and what kind of visceral response we have through that eye gate with which we define reality. Somewhere, of course, in the middle of this century, the world began to change. Our entire way of evaluating what we were up against came up against a couple of wars, and the war that was supposed to end all wars did not end all wars. And we found out at the end of this century that the German atheistic philosopher Nietzsche was more correct than many other utopianists. For Nietzsche, when he died in 1900, before that, having spent the last 13 to 14 years moving between sanity and insanity, he said because of the, quote, death of God in the 19th century, the 20th century would become the bloodiest century in history, and a sort of universal madness would break out. The same year also died the noted writer Oscar Wilde, who had sort of gone into that marvelous orb of pleasure. And as he lay on his bed dying in Paris with one of his closest friends, he voiced to that friend of his, and I think some of the most impassioned words ever written. He said, "Everything in the garden of life that portended pain and suffering, I resisted. Everything that intimated pleasure and delight, I went towards. And what I have ended up doing is meeting the pain and the suffering, except I have come to it the wrong way around." That life of hedonism let him down. And the ideas of secularism still continue to hold sway. But in the middle of all of this, the categories are being eroded. In the 1980s, Daniel Yankelevich, borrowing a definition from sociologist Daniel Bell, defined culture in these words. He said, "Culture is the effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives." A very succinct definition. It is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. I remember in one very prominent university, where halfway through my lecture when I gave that definition addressing a different subject, one woman stood up and went to the microphone and said, "Who ever told you that culture needs to find a coherent set of answers? Where did you get that from?" I said, "Well, the definition wasn't mine. I was quoting Yankelevich, who borrowed it from Daniel Bell." I said, "Do you have a problem with it?" She said, "Yes." She said, "It is another one of those Western ideas foisted upon humanity. Where do you get the idea that we have to find a coherent set of answers?" I said, "All right, ma'am, just so I can be clear on where you're coming from, in my answer to you, do you want my answer to be coherent, or may I be incoherent in responding to you?" There was laughter and then pin-drop silence from her as she stood in front of the microphone. She had just pulled out the rug on which she was standing. There was no foundational legitimacy to her very question, because if I were to assume her own presuppositions there, I did not have to deliver a meaningful answer at all. But that showed me the nerve that runs through these issues. It is a very tender nerve, and if that nerve is not properly handled, and if it is severed in reality, we will find ourselves incoherently responding to one another. What is it that has happened in culture to question even the ideas of coherence that are so fundamental? I present these 3 moods as we race along against the clock here. The first description, I think, of our way of thinking today is aptly described as the process of secularization. Now, I didn't say mere secularism. I'm talking about secularization. And secularization is the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. Secularization, the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. There's kind of an inversion that has taken place in society. Once upon a time, in our answers, if the worldview was considered to be systemically religious, it was accepted that from that there would be some entailments. Now, if it is assumed for a moment that there is a religious worldview at the heart of your answer, the entailments are dismissed, or a long conversation emerges in which you've got to start justifying your very first principles here. Some years ago in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, there was a major trial for a pornographer whose stuff was described as so bad that it made ordinary pornography look pretty decent. But it took them many, many days to even select the members of a jury, because one of the questions the defense team was asking potential jurors was this question: are you a member of a local church? And in the South, of course, a lot of people are members of local churches. And if the answer was in the affirmative, yes, I'm a member of the local church, they were almost automatically dismissed because they were assumed to have a bias against pornography. But what is interesting is how the defense lawyer proceeded in his questioning of the witnesses who were describing the horrific stuff that this particular man had put on the pages of his products and so on. The way he asked the question was so brilliant that any thinking person would have to step back and say, this is not going to be an easy question to respond to, particularly in the context of sitting in a witness stand and giving brief soundbite answers to the questioning attorney. So he looked at one of the potential jurors and he said, sir, have you ever been into an art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into that art gallery? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into an art gallery where there are paintings by the grand masters of art? Yes. Have you ever paid to go into a gallery where the paintings by the grand masters where there are paintings of disrobed or unclothed people present in that art gallery? Yes. Would you please explain to this jury why you paid to do that, go into it, and call that art, and call my client's products pornography? How do you answer that? How do you answer that without first even establishing a worldview and the basis of reference for what is aversion and what is a perversion? I recall as I sat back thinking to myself, this was an impossible situation within that context. But then I asked myself the question, Ravi, what would you do if you were sitting across this lawyer who actually believed that line of questioning to be legitimate? How would you answer him? And that's where the real challenge comes. Because, if you find one or two things in common between two things, how do you establish the fundamental differences between them without going through the whole process of evaluating what is truth and what is false? But I recall a couple of illustrations that did come into my mind. A couple of them were these. When Michelangelo first started to paint unclothed people in his artwork, his teacher called him aside and he said to him, why are you doing this? And Michelangelo said to him, because I want to see man as God sees man. And the teacher just snapped back and said, but you're not God, are you? There is a pointed question even in that small dialogue that needs to be pursued a little further. But let's go on even deeper into this issue, because I think here's where the categories seem to become so blurred. And the illustration I borrow is from C.S. Lewis's writings, A Pilgrim's Regress. You may remember the kind of book A Pilgrim's Regress is. It is an allegorical style book of Lewis's conversion. In Surprised by Joy, it's a straightforward story of how he had come to Christ thinking he'd come to a place. He found out he'd come to a person. But in this particular one, A Pilgrim's Regress, he is going through the philosophical challenges he faced as a young man. At some points struggling between naturalism and theism. At other points between pantheism and theism, one of the greatest struggles of his life. But in the naturalistic framework in this allegorical story, and by the way, he calls it A Pilgrim's Regress rather than progress, in distinction to Bunyan's book, it's because he says when he faced all these options along the way, He rejected many of them, even when he did not have a satisfactory, rational answer for why he was turning away from some of these options. It is only when he came to find that personal relationship with Christ that he took a regressive journey, and he had the more complete answers to explain the reasons for those other rejections. At one point, he is here trapped in a mountain called the spirit of the age. His description is fascinating. He describes he who guards this framework of naturalism as grim, austere, looking down upon his subjects with a kind of a Neronic stare, controlling them. The hands are cuffed of those who live within this mountain called the spirit of the age. Quite a description, isn't it? We think when you live by boundless pleasure, you are absolutely free. Lewis reverses that and says you are actually enchained during that process. And he says, here I was with my hands bound in this mountain called the spirit of the age, hands within loosened to serve me my meal. And as the breakfast came to me, I made the mistake of commenting to the waiter, representing the spirit of the age, how tasty the milk was. And the waiter looked at me and said, you just call it milk. All it is the secretion of a cow. What is the difference between its urine and its milk? They're both secretions, aren't they? And young John, given to the name of this young man, Lewis representing himself, said he cringed, but he did not know how to respond. A few minutes later, he said, I made an even bigger mistake and commented on the deliciousness of the eggs. He says, then you should have seen the description the waiter gave of what the eggs actually were. He said, and I remained silent until some moments went by and reason came riding on a horse and lifted me and rescued me. And as reason was rescuing me, turned around and looked at the spirit of the age and said, sir, you lie. You lie because you do not know the difference between what nature has meant for nourishment and what nature has meant for refuse or garbage. The problem with naturalism is it does not know where to draw the lines of distinction between that which is there for our nourishment and that which is there for refuse and garbage. No matter how much they have tried, take the best-known writers representing them, Kai Nielsen from Canada, Richard Dawkins from Oxford, even Bertrand Russell, the inability to rationally arrive at an objective moral ethic. So much so, at a point, Richard Dawkins actually says this, and I quote, he says, the reason we have religious and moral thoughts within our thinking is because something has gone wrong with the software of humanity. It's a virus that has entered our thinking. We need to somehow expunge this virus. And he even dismisses a category called evil. Clearly, he says, he doesn't know how we can even arrive at such a category. But you see, when you look at these issues being drawn in as parallels, as pornography and as art, at least there are some fundamental lines of difference, aren't there, regardless of the external similarities? If, for example, an artist takes a canvas and is painting the disrobed body with his mind, thinking of whatever ill thoughts he may or she may or may not have, suppose that is the end result and the process is carried on very judiciously. There is no way for the canvas or the paint or the oil to shout out and scream out at the artist and say, please do not do this to me. There is no way to respond. But if a young woman is being taken in front of the lens of a camera, the purpose of those doing that to her is to exploit her very physical features, to be used in titillating the fanciful imagination of somebody buying that, to provoke that person to an insatiable road that moves him along more and more and more till it completely skews and damages the imagination. Ought not that person to reconsider for a moment and say to the person using her, please don't do this to me? But the end result of a sheer naturalistic framework spelt with a capital N is that she will not respond that way because she will have ultimately at their hands had the erosion of a sense of shame. When shame has been jettisoned from our society, you will find how incredible the mind becomes. You remember what Ted Bundy said some months before? He looked at the people who asked him if he had not felt any guilt with the path that he had taken. Here's exactly what he says. I do not feel any guilt. In fact, I feel sorry for anyone who does feel any sense of guilt. And at the judgment, the judge looked at him and said, Mr. Bundy, I am so sorry that a man as brilliant as you, sir, wreaked such havoc in your life. He'd lost his points of reference. He'd lost that sense of how to arrive at what was a shameful act and what is not a shameful act. When secularism has done its doing, may I suggest to you, think through it very carefully, that we may actually end up producing a generation of men and women who've lost their sense of shame. And you show me a man or woman without a sense of shame, I will show you a potentially deadly weapon you're looking at. It was Adolf Hitler, whose writing is on the walls of Auschwitz, who said, I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel. And he nearly succeeded. Secularization ends up with no sense of shame. Where religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance, how do you arrive at a transcendent moral basis or any objective moral law? The next mood we have is that of pluralization, where we have a competing number of worldviews available to our members and no one worldview is dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to our members and no one worldview is dominant. Now, just to be sure, let me qualify it first by saying I think pluralization is a wonderful and a fascinating thing. It has its many, many strengths. One of the things pluralism does, by the way, is that it compels every individual to take serious note of what he or she actually believes of internal value and why he or she believes it. I was raised in a pluralistic culture, although it was predominantly Hindu. 80% of India is Hindu, 10% Muslim. Then you've got the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Jains, the Christians, and numerous other small groups of believers, the Baha'is and so on. And you get the feel of a pluralism. And this pluralistic thing is a fascinating thing. I, for example, love what pluralization has done in the world of cuisine. It's fantastic. I mean, it is absolute folly to ask anybody whether he wants a hamburger or curry and rice. The decision is obvious. What it is that 1 billion people would choose. You just see it, you walk through some parts of North America. I remember walking through the streets of Miami and seeing a sign outside the store, English spoken here. I said, thankfully I can get some answer now to my questions, and stepped in. The world of pluralization, Peter Wagner has a quip about this in California, and that's why, by the way, pluralization is often described as the Los Angelesization of the world. But Peter Wagner talks about pluralization on the streets of Los Angeles, where there is a fast food outlet owned by a Korean who is selling kosher tacos. There's culinary pluralism for you. It is wonderful to have that in cuisine. It is wonderful to have it in accents. I honestly say to you with no pretense, people often say to me, it must be so hard to be traveling so much. Yes, it is. And for 30 years I have crisscrossed this globe. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I can get off in Amman or in Beirut or in Cairo or in Delhi or in Bombay or in Barcelona and get on the phone and call a good friend. And it's wonderful to hear these accents. It's even wonderful to hear counter perspectives and be compelled to measure and evaluate your own, sometimes at the point of discomfort. Having said all of that, here then is the big qualifier. If pluralization is extrapolated into meaning moral relativism, that's when the danger signs begin. Peter Berger said it well. Pluralism breeds a philosophical relativism. in which the average person stands confused as to whether any single voice among the contending options lays claim to the truth. We appear as a reed shaken in the wind. Think of the simple statement, all truth is relative. What does that mean? If all truth is relative and the statement stands as it is given, does that statement include itself or exclude itself? If it includes itself, that must mean even that statement is relative, which means it isn't always true. If it excludes itself, it's providing for itself a nimbus of positing an absolute while denying they actually exist. And you know what? I'll say this to you as honestly as I can, and I see a mixed audience here. Asians, Middle Easterners, Orientals, even though some of their worldviews will sometimes bring in the idea of pluralism, they know very well when it is being violated and where there are untradeable absolutes in all of them. When I was in front of an NPR radio interview last week, and he looks at me and he says, Christianity is so exclusivistic. I said, have you ever read any of the other major religions? Islam is exclusivistic. Hinduism is exclusivistic. Buddhism is exclusivistic. In fact, Buddhism was birthed by Gautama Buddha, who was born a Hindu and rejected two of the fundamental tenets of Hinduism. All major religions at their core have some non-negotiable truths which they will not trade away. Well, one of the Baha'is said, well, we include everything. I said, yeah, but you exclude the exclusivists. You do. You see, somewhere there is an epistemological base. And when you start lifting the layers of it, you begin to see that somewhere every one of us has that non-negotiable commitment to the way we arrive at truth. And that's where a lot of the discussion can intelligently take place. When I was in front of an NPR radio interview last week, and he looks at me and he says, Christianity is so exclusivistic. I said, have you ever read any of the other major religions? Islam is exclusivistic. Hinduism is exclusivistic. Buddhism is exclusivistic. In fact, Buddhism was birthed by Gautama Buddha, who was born a Hindu and rejected two of the fundamental tenets of Hinduism. All major religions at their core have some non-negotiable truths which they will not trade away. Well, one of the Baha'is said, well, we include everything. I said, yeah, but you exclude the exclusivists. You do. You see, somewhere there is an epistemological base. And when you start lifting the layers of it, you begin to see that somewhere every one of us has that non-negotiable commitment to the way we arrive at truth. And that's where a lot of the discussion can intelligently take place. Now, let me give you a fascinating illustration of this. You'll have to forgive me if you've heard it, but I don't know how to better tell it after all these years. And so this is the best way. I happened to be speaking in California several years ago, and a professor from the local university, an American gentleman who was professor of philosophy, came up to the front to challenge me. And he said, Mr. Zacharias, I want you to do me a favor. You are a Christian, I see. I said, yes, sir. He said, will you one day this week speak on the subject why you are not a Hindu? I said, what do you want me to do that for? He said, because I will bring my class. He said, I have become one of that persuasion, and I will bring my whole class, and after you finish that subject, they will just rip you to shreds. I said, you consider that an enticing invitation for me that I have to do this? And I said, no. I said, even if they weren't going to rip me to shreds, that's not what I want to talk about. I said, but I tell you what, one night this week I'm speaking on why I am a Christian. You bring your class and let them have a go at me at that time. I said, implicit in why I am this is why I'm not anything else. He said, well, I don't quite like that, but okay, we'll come. And he came, and one of the concepts I gave was that in some of the Eastern pantheistic worldviews, by their own recognition, there is systemic contradiction at the core. If you take the teachings of Shankara vis-a-vis Ramanuja, you will see the difference between the two. And I talked about the systemic contradictions that are of a very serious nature, even stated by Mahatma Gandhi. And so as I presented them and I finished, he came to the front and he said, you've got a big problem. The problem is you're studying an Eastern religion like a Westerner, and if you'd quit studying it like a Westerner and understand what the laws of logic really are, you'll see that systemic contradictions are not really a problem. Now, what was astounding about this was that this was a Westerner telling me that I was studying the Eastern religion as a Westerner, but I respected his office, so I said, I tell you what, sir. I said, your students are standing around here, you and I are going to get into an argument to try to impress them. I'm really not interested in that at all. I said, do me a favor, let's go out and have lunch one of these days. And I pulled a Josh McDowell line on him. I said, you pay and I'll pray and we'll meet. He said, all right, we'll do that. He said, can I bring the professor of psychology with me? I still don't know why he did, whether the psychologist wanted to study two subjects or not. But I said, I don't mind you bringing him. I said, but let's make this agreement. We're not there to impress him. You and I are going to talk, because you've made a tremendous allegation about my thinking. I want to talk to you about it. He said, that's fine. So we came, and the professor of psychology and I had already finished our meal. This gentleman hadn't even touched his. It was getting congealed sitting in front of him. And he was about a lecture in logic. He began by saying there are two kinds of logic. I knew right off the bat he wasn't headed in the right direction, because there are more than two kinds of logic. But he said there were two. And he said, one is the law of non-contradiction, the either-or system of logic, either this or that. And he went on to describe how the either-or functions in its affirmations and its denials and so on, went through the basic laws of logic, the law of rational inference and the undistributed middle, all of this. He went through all of that. And he said, so the either-or logic, that it is either this or that, is a Western way of thinking. I said, stop right there now. I said, I don't believe you are absolutely correct. He said, yes, I am. I said, no, you're not. He said, yes, I am. I said, no, you're not. I said, all right, just write it down. We'll come back to it. So he wrote it down and we came back. Then he went on. He said, the second is the both-hand kind of logic. It is the dialectical, a la Hegel in his ideational worldview, not the thesis or the antithesis. You pull them together, you find the synthesis. Or Karl Marx in his dialectical economic theory, you take the employer and the employee, find middle ground and bring them right in that median, as it were. So he said, this both and does not deal with things the way either or does. It is not the mutually exclusive, not the law of non-contradiction. It is dialectical. It is both and. It is an Eastern way of thinking. I said, the way I've stated it, I can't accept that. He said, yes, it's true. I said, no, it isn't. He said, it's true. I said, all right, write it down. We'll come back to it. Now, so he writes it down, and his placemats are used not only from our table, but from all the other tables. And he's going this either or, law of non-contradiction, both and, dialectical, either or, Western, both and, Eastern. For example, if you were to bump into me that morning, along with my wife, and you said to me, hi, Ravi and Margie, nice to meet you. And you were to say to me, Margie, I hear you are pregnant and you're expecting a baby. Is that true? What would you say if at the same time I said yes and she said no? Would you say, is this an Eastern way of thinking or is this a Western way of thinking? The same question at the same time, meaning the same thing, eliciting two opposite answers. I think you would either conclude that you asked the wrong question, that is not Margie, that's not my wife, we haven't talked about it, that we may need some marital counseling, that we have a weird sense of humor. You certainly would not conclude that your question has been answered. So I looked at him and I said, sir, here's my question for you. You have taken the Eastern way of thinking as both and dialectical, the Western way of thinking either or, either this or that, the law of non-contradiction, and you're telling me that I'm making a mistake when I'm studying an Eastern religion, say like Hinduism, and wondering whether it is right or wrong and studying it as a Westerner. Therefore, they think I've discounted the correct use of logic. He said, that is correct. I said, so let me ask you this question. What you're really saying to me is, when I study this particular religious system, I either use the both-hand method or nothing else. Is that right? That I either use the both-hand system of logic or nothing else. Is that right? At this point, the psychologist looked at him and grinned like saying, I think the lunch is over. But, the fascinating thing is what he said. He had just picked up his knife and fork and he put it down and he said, the either or does seem to emerge, doesn't it? I said, sir, I got some shocking news for you. Even in India, we look both ways before we cross the street. It is either the bus or me, not both of us, one of the two. Now, the problem is that he was partially correct. but he was in a total system false. There is a sense in which there is this pluralism of thinking, where different worldviews are brought in some kind of mix. But it is not at the heart of the belief system. I can assure you there are some unqualified non-negotiables. Shankara himself said that. Shankara dealt with this truth on the basis of debates, as did Gautama Buddha. And Gautama Buddha urged his followers to check out the reference, to check out the thinking, to check out the truths. I spent scores of hours with Buddhist monks last year before I wrote my book, The Lotus and the Cross. And you could see very quickly where those non-negotiables were. The denial of the essential nature of a self, the ultimate denial of all desires, and the denial of the very knowledge and the possibility of the knowledge of God, if not the denial of the very existence of God. The denial of the legitimacy of prayer because it assumes a significant other. You go on and on and on. And all I'm saying to you is that when you come down to the core of pluralization, while its culinary delights may be wonderful, while its accents may be a pleasure to the ears, while the friendships and the enrichments are numerous, it cannot take us to deny the law of non-contradiction, or we do so at enormous peril, and they will be the first ones to let you know that it is not denied in the core of their own cultures. I have never lectured at an Islamic university where they have not disagreed with the law of non-contradiction. Never. In fact, I've been invited to come and now deliver 2 lectures in Syria, in Aleppo, and in Damascus at their leading universities. They take in the law of non-contradiction and recognize it very well. And I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the peril of denying the law of non-contradiction is intense. Now, deep in our minds, I know the kind of thinking that does go on. We deal with paradoxes, we deal with various polarities of thinking and so on. And I'm not denying that there are times in our thinking and in our discussions where we run up against these kinds of mysteries that boggle the mind. But let us never forget, it was in reference to quantum that Einstein said, God does not play dice. He could not subscribe to a totally randomness at the underpinnings of this universe. And just in case we don't get it in our postmodern world, with such stark logic and prose, let's take the poet's view of this. I'm talking about Steve Turner, the English journalist, who gave me ready permission to use this. Steve Turner is kind of one of those satirists who looks at reality and then mocks our own duplicities. Listen to what he says about contemporary humanity, particularly the Western world. We believe in Marx, Freud, and Darwin. We believe everything is okay as long as you don't hurt anyone, to the best of your definition of hurt and to the best of your definition of knowledge. We believe in sex before, during, and after marriage. We believe in the therapy of sin. We believe that adultery is fun. We believe that taboos are taboo. We believe that everything's getting better despite evidence to the contrary. The evidence must be investigated, and you can prove anything with evidence. We believe there's something in horoscopes, UFOs, and bent spoons. Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, although we think some of his good morals were really bad. We believe that all religions are basically the same. At least the ones that we read were. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation. We believe that after death comes the nothing, because when you ask the dead what happens, they say nothing. If death is not the end, if the dead have lied, then it's compulsory heaven for all, excepting perhaps Hitler, Stalin, and Genghis Khan. We believe in Masters and Johnson. What's selected is average, what's average is normal, what's normal is good. We believe in total disarmament because we believe there are direct links between warfare and bloodshed. Americans should beat their guns into tractors and the Russians would be sure to follow. We believe that man is essentially good. It's only his behavior that lets him down. This is the fault of society. Society is the fault of conditions, and conditions are the fault of society. We believe that each man must find the truth that is right for him, and reality will adapt accordingly. The universe will readjust, history will alter. We believe that there is no absolute truth, accepting the truth that there is no absolute truth. We believe in the rejection of creeds and the flowering of individual thought. And then he puts this postscript: if chance be the father of all flesh, Disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, troops on rampage, youths go looting, bomb blasts school, it is but the sound of man worshipping his maker. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, youths go looting, bomb blast school, it's but the sound of man worshipping his maker. The logical outworking of what Nietzsche said is right. When you take away shame, when you take away reason, as pluralization does, and you move to the final thought of privatization. Secularization ends up with no shame. Pluralization ends up with no reason. And privatization ends up with no meaning. What do I mean by privatization? It is where there is a breakdown between your public and your private life, and you're compelled to take the things of ultimate value into the private world. So you can be religious in America now if you want, but don't bring it out into the public. You can do that in India, you can do that in the Middle East, but don't do it in America because we are plural. Severing the nerve of what is of ultimate value. Severing the nerve of what is of ultimate value. Keep your religion private. Keep your religion in your private world. And privatization is compelling of all faiths, particularly the Christian faith, to hibernate, to go out into a cloister, because to bring it into the public life is to violate the affirmations that we want to hold on to. And I say to you, we are living in dangerous times, not because of attacks from outside of this land, but because this land no longer knows what it believes. Until we know what we believe here and what it is that is worth preserving, we will never know what it is that's really being attacked. As one Middle Easterner said to a friend, while disavowing everything that has happened recently, said, we have a lot of freedoms here and a lot of buying power, but I'm getting convinced that the price is paid by our souls. The price is being paid by our souls. There are serious questions stalking. There are serious questions which are confronting us. And one of those is the Christian faith going to become purely a privatized thing? And if so, what we will really end up doing is breaking life's thread of meaning. You see an average young person in high school today, and he or she, what is endemic in our high schools is a loss of meaning. There is no meaning left in life. And so secularization ends to no shame, pluralization with no reason, privatization with no meaning. Let me end with a simple illustration and a quotation from Daniel Yankelevich, which basically sustains what I have said to you. An existentialist writer talks about a person who is a merchant and goes into the city one day to sell his diamonds. And he brings his wife in there for the first time, and she's nervous. So he's going about his business, and he tells her, why don't you visit the stores? I'll see you at the end of the day at this particular intersection. When he's gone, she begins to think this is the first time she's been freed, and first time she's back in an open arena of options, and thought of a teenage dream she used to have, which the writer doesn't tell us, but basically to say it was some kind of a sensuous dream. And she wonders, should she give in to it? She now has the opportunity, as she's alone. But she struggles because she wonders what would happen if her husband ever found out, what would this mean, and all of the ramifications back and forth. Finally, she somehow resists, meets her husband at the end of the day. They go and have dinner, go into a hotel room, check in for the night. Within minutes, he is sound asleep. She's lying with her head on the pillow, wide awake, saying, I may never have this chance again. She gets out of the room, quietly gets changed, goes out, in the words of the writer, enjoys the lust of the night. Comes back, gets changed. And back in bed, the husband has not known she's been gone. And as she lies in bed, now come the tears. The tears are coming down the side of the face, first gently, then more and more, till uncontrollably she sits up in bed and sobs, sobbing her heart out. And the husband, jolted awake, sits up, sees her, and puts his arm around her and says, what's the matter? What's the matter? What's happened? And she just shoves him away and says, nothing. Just nothing. That is good existential anticlimax. Because the loneliest moment in life is when you have just experienced that which you thought would deliver the ultimate and it's let you down. And you have done so at the cost of some boundaries that you had drawn and some lines that defined who you were in your conscience, not just who you were in your social preferences. And I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, the categories are struggling. We cannot define them anymore because secularism has led to a loss of shame, pluralization to a loss of reason. Who needs even explain that anymore with postmodernism? And privatization with a loss of meaning. Now, just in case you think that the Christian preacher is the only one who's sort of sounding forth this warning, listen to Yankelovich and how he ends his extensive article on the breadth of change that takes place when culture has lost its point of reference and how high the stakes are. He does numerous studies of various individuals and couples, and his closing paragraph is this, after studying one couple and making his conclusions. If you feel it is imperative to fill all your needs, and what I would say therefore is that there's no categories anymore, and if these needs are contradictory, or simply in conflict with those of others, or simply unfillable, then frustration inevitably follows. To Abby and to Mark as well, self-fulfillment means having a career, and marriage, and children, and sexual freedom, and autonomy, and being liberal, and having money, and choosing nonconformity, and insisting on social justice, and enjoying city life, and country living, and simplicity, and graciousness, and reading, and good friends, and on and on. You see, the individual is not truly fulfilled by becoming ever more autonomous, says Yankelovich. Indeed, he says to move too far in this direction is to risk psychosis, the ultimate form of autonomy. And then he gives these brilliant lines. The injunction that to find oneself, one must lose oneself, contains a truth any seeker of self-fulfillment needs to grasp. You know, I know of nowhere else where that statement comes to full expression than at the cross of Jesus Christ. And so I leave you with 4 applications. Number 1, how have these moods affected the Church of Jesus Christ? Have we bought into them and been suctioned in by them? Number 2, the challenge to regain critical thinking is very critical indeed. It is imperative we teach our young people to think again. Number 3, how are we going to learn to defend the Scriptures, which the Word reminds us cannot be broken? And the metaphor God used was, in the beginning was the Word, not in the beginning was video, in the beginning was the Word. That metaphor that he chose is a powerful metaphor. How do we defend the Word of God in today's society? And lastly, how do we regain or retain the integrity of worship? The risks we flirt with today in the Christian world, where worship has become an experience rather than a way of life, is a very, very risky proposition. How do we keep worship holding its theological integrity and finding its existential relevance? If we do not understand how to retain its integrity and maintain relevance, we will lose one of the two in the process, and the church either becomes irrelevant or loses truth in the process. These are the issues that confront us, and I think they are very pivotal. How we deal with them will determine how we move in the years ahead in a world that's struggling to find answers.